Good morning, good afternoon, good night. I never know what to say because we're recording at one time, but those of you who are watching us will not only be at a different time of day, but at a different week. I'm really pleased to be coming back to Family Voice as a little kind of harkening back to a few months ago in preparation for our annual event, and joined by Rachael Wardell, who is, well, Rachael, shall I let you introduce yourself, and then we can start with some of the questions we've been hearing from parents.
Okay, yes. So I'm Rachael Wardell. I'm the Executive Director for Children, Families and Lifelong Learning at Surrey County Council.
Lovely. Thank you so much. So we, for the last few years at Family Voice, we've themed our annual events to try and focus on different kind of crunch points for families who have children with additional needs. And this year we're focusing on that really tricky transition between primary school and secondary school. So I was wondering if you could tell us, as the executive director, what do you think about when you're looking at the cohort of children moving from primary to secondary? Because you're in charge of all children in Surrey, aren't you?
Sort of, yes. So I'll say a bit about my role, and then I'll say a little bit about that really important kind of transition point. So I'm the executive director with responsibility for a directorate, an overarching, a sort of umbrella directorate called Children, Families and Lifelong Learning, that is separated into 5 kind of subsidiary directorates, each of which is run by a director. And the one that's probably of most interest to people today is called Education and Lifelong Learning, and the director there is one of my colleagues, Liz Mills. We've also got directorates of social care, and some social workers that your families may work with will be situated in those directorates under the leadership of other directors. And we also have a directorate of commissioning, and that is the function that kind of commissions home to school transport and commissions placements, including places where children live and also where they go to school. So there's about 3,500 people in the directorate, which is about probably 2,500 kind of separate roles. Obviously, some people are working flexibly, so that the head count and the number of actual kind of jobs there are in the directorate is different. And it's my responsibility to try and make sure that the kind of the funding and the organisational structure and the vision and the culture of the directorate are right to enable those people to do good work in their individual roles. So I suppose the first thing that I should say is that there are lots of people much more close to that transition from primary to secondary school who are spending a lot more time thinking about your children on a day-to-day basis than I am, if I'm honest. And they will be closely engaged in thinking about individual children's move from one school to another, particularly where a child has additional needs of any kind, and where we might be involved in the provision of an education, health and care plan or other arrangements, and working closely with the child and with their family. But we also do think about, whole year groups. So we work with all of Surrey's schools, whether they are maintained schools where local authorities still have a bit of responsibility, or academies, which kind of are their own entities. They're state schools, but they kind of run themselves, or indeed independent schools, which are kind of, as the name suggests, they're not, we don't have any sort of responsibility to them, but we do of course have an interaction with them, because we do have that responsibility for all the children. And so in that sense, as a whole directorate, we're really aware of those points in the year which make a big difference to children and their families, including the start of a new school year in the autumn. And within that, what we often refer to in the kind of jargon as key stage transitions. So you might hear someone talk about a key stage transition. When we are using jargon like that, what we really mean is when children come from an early year setting into reception, in a primary school, or when children who were in year 6 last year start in year 7 in a secondary school, and the post 16, after year 11 and into year 12, that transition into sixth form. And for some of our schools, obviously, there's also a transition between the end of key stage 1, which is the end of year 2, and into year 3, because in some places we've got infants and junior schools rather than primary schools. So all of those are important. I think probably the 2 most significant ones for children and for parents are that first one, when you go from an earlier setting, or sometimes from home, into primary school for the first time, and then from primary to secondary at the end of year 6, start of year 7. And that, I think, is huge, because secondary schools, they're not very cozy, are they? And quite a lot of our primary schools are a size and a scale that children and young people can adapt to, and kind of it feels like a safe first step away from home or away from your early years setting. But in many cases, secondary schools are much bigger institutions than a child would have ever encountered before. And so that's a very big deal. So in terms of thinking about that group of young people who are making that transition, what I think about, what my directors think about, and what the staff and the directorate think about is what would a good transition look like, both for that whole year group and also for the individual children within that year group.
Can I ask you, you mentioned when you were starting to talk that one of your roles is to shape the culture of the directorate. And one of the things that we hear a lot from parents is that, particularly when moving from primary to secondary school, the culture of the school system is very, very different. We find, so, at the primary school, it's much easier to have an interaction with the teachers as a parent than it is in secondary school. There's very quickly, from year 7, the sense you get told as a parent, don't you, when your child needs to become independent. I wonder, as the local authority, how do you manage and do you have a way of influencing that culture? We talk about inclusion a lot, don't we? And for our children with additional needs, actually, if we could make a secondary school kinder, more friendly, more accommodating, for a lot of them, they would be able to manage where sometimes they're falling out of that system. So I wonder, how can you influence the culture of schools?
Yeah. So yes, we can influence the culture of schools, but not easily and not directly. And so it's about collaborative work and kind of thinking together, planning together, and sharing how we want to think about children and young people, and how we would like schools to think about children and young people. So what gets in the way, I think, sometimes of secondary schools behaving like primary schools do is partly the volume of children arriving and leaving every day, and also the fact that in many cases those children aren't arriving with a parent. So often parents are walking their children to primary school, much less likely to be so with secondary school, although some still do. And so you don't have that same, you do have an on the gate culture actually in secondary schools. Every secondary school I know has got people on the gate at the start and the end of the day, but it won't necessarily be a teacher that the parent knows well. It might be a head of year, it might be some class teachers. And so you don't have the same kind of close connection. There's a fair chance that if you, through the years your child is at primary school, you'll see maybe the same 2 or 3 people day after day after day on the school gate, and you'll get to know them quite well, and they will know you. In secondary, even though there's a presence on the gate, or sometimes the multiple gates every day, there's a fair chance that it will be a teacher that doesn't teach your child. And even if it's a teacher that teaches your child, they're seeing them for a handful of hours every fortnight or so, rather than all day, every day in the classroom. So already that makes it harder. It does make it harder for individual teachers to be kind, but it does make it harder for individual teachers to build the kind of relationship that you will have recognised from primary school. And it's when you don't have that kind of relationship, it makes it harder to have the conversations that you might need to have about a child. So I think the first thing to say is to just to recognise that the environment is very different, and to a certain extent the environment shapes the culture as well. So then in terms of influence, the way that we influence is that we share how we think about children in the way that we talk with the schools. And so we, Benedict, you've referenced inclusion, thinking about inclusion, and we do talk a lot and more than we used to about inclusion with our schools. We have something called the Inclusion Roundtable, which is work that we're undertaking with many of our schools who want to find ways to make it possible for more young people, maybe with some additional needs, to be comfortable and happy and do well in their schools. So we're starting with schools that have, are leaning in that direction already and want to kind of show how it's done and to kind of share their practice. We've built capacity around inclusion and additional needs. So there are now, and 2 years ago this wasn't so, but over the last couple of years we've recruited for assistant directors in the Education and Lifelong Learning Directorate who are geographically based. So they've got responsibility for each of 4 patches in Surrey, and that makes it possible for them to get to know their schools and their head teachers in a way that wasn't possible before, when there was just a kind of a director of education and lifelong learning who is terrific but just can't get round. Yeah. I've worked out if I saw a school every week, it would take me a decade to see every Surrey school. So you do need to kind of have more distributed leadership to do that, and by putting those posts in place and by styling them as roles that are about inclusion and additional skills, we're kind of taking that conversation to schools more directly. And then we are challenging schools in a way that I hope is kind of, a balance of high support and high challenge, but we're challenging schools to make sure that they are offering their ordinarily available provision. In other words, what the school does routinely to support children is increasingly kind of strong in terms of inclusion practice, which will over time mean that children are less likely to need specific school support and very much less likely to need an education, health and care plan, because the school's kind of flexing its offer in an appropriate way to meet that child's needs. So those are the kind of ongoing points of influence that we have, I think.
Great. Thank you. So you talked a little bit about at the beginning, you mentioned the commissioning thing and the 4 kind of patches. I know that capital investment's been a big part of the SEND transformation programme in the last couple of years. I lose track of time. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, I suppose, how is it going, and what feedback do you have both from families and school leaders about how that's working?
So it's going well. It's going well in a number of ways. So it's going well in that the commitment is there and really strong. So there's a huge financial investment by the council, over £100 million, and it will deliver over time nearly 2,000 places, and so over 280 of those opening in this school year, and a similar sort of number last year, and more to come. And what that does is that creates scope for children to be educated closer to home. I mean, ideally in a school that is genuinely near to where they live, even if it's a specialist provision. And some of it, these are specialist schools, and some of it is specialist places within mainstream schools. So kind of real variety of provisions. So the capital investment commitment is there. The programme is running largely on time. So sometimes the doors don't open quite when we would want them to, but essentially they're opening as we would want to and expect. I think everyone would like it to be a bit faster, because it makes such a difference, doesn't it, if you've got a place. And also sometimes when we know that the places are coming but they're not quite there yet, we're tentatively offering a place, and a family might want it very much, but the school hasn't opened yet, and that also feels uncertain and people are worried about it. So I think people would like greater speed and greater certainty, and that's not straightforward to deliver. It's hard to kind of run multiple big capital projects on multiple fronts at once, but we are very kind of committed to the rollout at the current pace, and as I say, that's going well. In terms of feedback, it's really interesting how very quickly something that was a pipe dream a couple of years ago just becomes part of provision. Yeah. So for a new intake in a school that 2 or 3 years ago didn't exist, now it's a school that is a kind of first option for them, and they make an application and they're admitted to the admissions process, and they're there. And in some ways, the feedback is, I mean, for some families where their child has had a really difficult time finding a place that suits them, and they're at last in a place, and perhaps a newly created place, then we do sometimes get really lovely feedback about how well a child has settled. But for some families, they simply don't know that 2 years ago this would have been impossible, and now it's possible. And in a way, not hearing from those families that they want something that they can't have is the best feedback of all, because we've solved the problem there.
Yes, no, that's really interesting. I suppose I know we don't have very much time, and there's so much I could ask you. I think it would be really interesting that we hear a lot from families that if something isn't going very well with a school placement, they try and contact the local authority and very quickly get kind of shunted into the formal complaints process, which unfortunately then leads to very wishy-washy answers. I wonder, do you have a mechanism, or are you considering a mechanism where parents might be able to inform you? Say, actually, this doesn't feel great. It's not, I'm not wanting to make a big fuss, but you need to know as the local authority that the provision that's described doesn't actually feel like what we're experiencing. Because there seems to be sometimes a mismatch. And it's very difficult as a parent to be able to say, this is my experience, and you probably need to look at it.
Yeah, that is really tricky. And it's, part of the reason it's tricky is because if we don't frame something as a complaint, kind of what is it then, and what should we do with it? So some levels of parental unhappiness with the provision at a school, it would be reasonable to expect parents to talk with the school, and for the school to respond to the parent. And because local authorities aren't directly running schools anymore, that is a kind of school to parent and parent to school relationship. But of course, where a parent maybe is raising something and over time persistently the school isn't responding, or where multiple parents may have a similar concern about the same school, then we would want to know that would reflect our we would reflect on that in our kind of commissioning decisions and placement decisions, if we kind of understand it in a broad way. But in terms of dealing with the kind of individual parents' concerns, the only sort of channel to sort of close it down, in a sense, to decide this is the issue, this is what we've done, this is dealt with, or indeed not dealt with, is the complaints route. So I can go away and think about it more. But you're right, it's a tricky category for it to fall into, and for us to kind of engage with.
It feels important because the formality of the complaints process means that, first of all, parents need to understand how to phrase a complaint to get a concrete outcome. So a lot of the outcomes tend to be, we're sorry you feel that way, but nothing actually changes. And the parent to school relationship can be very difficult because the school protects its own little bubble. So I think it's something that our members at Family Voice, I think, would be really interested in. How do we make sure what you were describing, if you've got one individual where things just aren't resolving, or indeed a group of parents, understanding how the local authority can really be informed feels like a really important piece of work.
Yeah, and I think the distinction, the reason the complaints process kind of exists is to kind of provide a pathway for a resolution to this thing that has been raised. Making sure the local authority is informed is a slightly different thing. And sometimes, of course, it's the accumulation of information over time, which is not necessarily visible to the parent or parents who shared the original information. And from my end, I can think of conversations that I have with my senior officers about individual schools where it's clear that they are absorbing this information. Right. And they are thinking about it, and it is reflected back in our relationships with those schools, both positive and negative, actually. And of course, we hear lovely things sometimes, and we share those too, and use those to, for example, identify the schools that we would like to provide support and expertise to other schools. So I'm conscious that is kind of, that definitely does the rounds, and it's in people's heads, and we're thinking about it and responding to it. What we're not doing, of course, is necessarily kind of going back to those parents originally and going, that thing that you told me a few months ago, well, 3 other parents said something similar, and then I raised it with the school, and now this has happened, and this is the outcome, because it's very difficult to kind of manage that sort of spider's web of information. So I'll keep thinking about it. I would want to assure you and the people who are viewing this that we don't ignore it, although sometimes it does take a while for it to kind of accumulate from different places, but I appreciate that it's not always very visible that that's what's happening, that it's kind of percolating through. The one other thing I would say is, if you've got one parent who is kind of persistently finding their engagement with the school is not kind of resulting in the outcomes that they want. Actually, the place that they should go to is after they've used the school's own complaints mechanism and the school's governing body, it is Ofsted and indeed the Department for Education, and it's very kind of clearly framed that the council doesn't have a role in those kind of individual complaints, which is quite tricky. And sometimes Ofsted comes back to us anyway and says, will you check this out? Will you check that out? But the route is that route.
So this, I mean, I suppose it follows on nicely into my next question, because I think one of the things that we would also say is it's something that the Parent Carer Forum can play a really vital role in, I think, because when we hear the stories from parents, we're then able to present them to the people we work with at the council, aren't we? And my next question was, how does your relationship with Family Voice affect your decision making?
Oh, yeah, that's a good and interesting question. And it probably affects my individual decision making relatively little, because I'm not that I'm ignoring Family Voice, but because I'm not instrumental in individual decisions about where children are educated or how they're educated or how they're getting to and from school. But what I learn through Family Voice does influence my thinking around kind of strategy, strategic direction, vision for our children and families and for children's education, and kind of their wider well-being in Surrey. So in that sense, the conversations that we have and have had in the past have been instrumental in kind of painting a picture of families' experience. So I'm not sitting at my desk thinking, I heard this from Family Voice Surrey and I've got this happening for this particular child and therefore I'm going to do this about it. It doesn't work like that. But as a for instance, I remember you doing an input in one of our transformation boards, which was about some relatively modest adjustments, but absolutely crucial, that a particular setting had made in response to a child, which transformed that child's experience. And it was a really good example of what can be ordinarily available actually in a school that can make that school a kind of livable, workable environment for the child. And those kind of inputs from yourself and also from others in Family Voice, they do influence how I support and engage all of the kind of strategic initiatives in the directorate. So that, for example, leans me more into the work that supports schools to kind of flex what they would offer all pupils, and to think kind of creatively about small adjustments that they can do, rather than to kind of emphasize more structural solutions, like, you know, building even more, we are building more schools, but building even more schools, or because our ambition is not to isolate children with additional needs. It's for them to be integrated and for them to go to school with their brothers and sisters. So a kind of really strong theme for us as a leadership team is belonging, and that is unquestionably influenced by the way that you know, we have worked with and listened to Family Voice over years, including before my time, actually.
I have to say, and from my perspective, I think one of the things that really strikes me is that as the Parent Carer Forum, Family Voice feels central to almost every bit of work within the directorate, and whereas we might not be directly speaking to you very frequently personally, actually we are sitting on the additional needs and inclusion board, and all of these things where our voice is often not only welcomed but requested and invited.
Absolutely.
And it's just interesting to, I suppose, to think about whether that is influential in culture change, and are we able to point to actually what decisions within the council were made because Family Voice brought in the lived experience perspective?
I mean, it is harder to answer the second part of that question, because so much goes into influencing a decision. But it is definitely true that we talk with each other about things that we have heard from Family Voice Surrey. We share information and resources, so things that have slides that have been presented at one board will find their way into another team meeting, because the message gets carried. And the other thing is, I think that there's a broad influence which is about listening to parents and carers. So not only does Family Voice exist as an entity and influence us, but having a kind of thoughtful and respectful dialogue ongoing means that we are culturally more likely to listen to parents and carers' voices generally as well.
Indeed.
Really good example that I would give of that is that some work that we're doing around promoting autism awareness training has been supported by eliciting feedback from parents of children who have described to us the difference it makes to work with a practitioner who understands autism well. And we've got little kind of vignettes of those kind of successes and also kind of some failures, because they're contrasting their experiences. And at the moment I write to my directorate every week with various updates, and under the banner of kind of promoting that training, I'm sharing each week some of that parental feedback. So there's something just about how Family Voice Surrey, by introducing that kind of parent and carer voice into the heart of what we're doing, encourages us to draw on it more often across lots of domains.
Great, thank you so much. I have loads of other questions, but I'm also aware that we've taken up quite a lot of time and maybe they need to be passed on to my successor for a next time. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm excited to see all of the various things that Family Voice have got ready for in November for the annual event. Thank you so much.
I'm excited too. It's always a pleasure talking to you, Benedict, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with Family Voice Surrey. They're very important to us. Thank you.
Thank you.